They are arguing regularly still that the biggest threat to this country is white supremacy.
Let's get to the white supremacy issue here as raised by Joe Biden in the speech at Howard University. A lot of people, I'll just tell you, everybody, a lot of people are having a moment here where they're like, Joe Biden is even more shameless and reckless than we anticipated. Play the clip.
Stand up against the poison of white supremacy, as I did my inaugural address, to single out as the most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy. And I'm not saying this because I'm at a black HBCU. I say it wherever I go.
Now, there are so many questions here. First off, in what universe is it a thing you should bring up at a, I mean, it was a graduation, wasn't it? This is, it's a commencement address, graduating class. So what is this telling? And this is at a historically black college, HBCU, historically black college or university. So it's one of these moments in time where you say, Joe Biden takes this, an opportunity where he could be inspiring people, where he could be telling them about, one, celebrating the accomplishment that they've already had, graduating from Howard's a great school. People go on from Howard to do great things. You would think that's the moment. But for Joe Biden going into an election year, looking as decrepit and dementia-addled as he often does, whatever pandering he has to do, whatever level of political just cheap shot he has to take, he's willing to. And that's why when he says he's talking about how white supremacy is the biggest terrorist threat to the homeland, I would sit here and say, okay, what is the scale of this terrorist threat? How many people in a country of 330 million people, Clay, when we look at the data, are dying from white supremacist terrorism in any given year? And we could also have a whole conversation about people who used to say that we overemphasize jihadist terrorism. Well, we had a not even really a multi-trillion dollar security apparatus that was overwhelmingly devoted to that problem, which was dealing with a very small percentage of the population in this country. And they were always saying we were exaggerating the jihadist threat. And then you look at this, the white supremacist threat. Okay, well, why is he telling everybody this at this graduation? And what really is the scale of this threat? These are the questions that I would want someone to ask Joe Biden.
Yeah, look, the reality here is pretty clear. This is a made-up story. And for everybody out there listening to us right now, I would just break down the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. Did we hear this argument about white supremacy at all? Did we ever hear anyone out there saying, oh, the nation is under a desperate attack from white supremacists? Of course not. And so what has happened? And you can even see it, Buck. We've talked about this on the show. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they've sort of CNN, MSNBC, taken this lie and run with it. Well, this is where I wish. I mean, I really wish. If we want to have a real conversation about crime, remember, I've said this before, Buck, but Ross Perot style, do you remember when he used to, back in 1992, rent out time and stand in front of an easel with like his pointer, and he would talk about the budget deficit, and he just basically would try to make an argument? It'd be like a 30-minute presentation. I feel like we need that on crime in this country, right? Who is actually committing the crimes? Who is actually dying? Because the reality is every time there's a mass shooting, and you pointed this out well, and I think it's important, people rush out and talk about the mass shootings. But if we eliminated every mass shooting in America, 98% of murders would still happen. And the reality is white supremacists commit almost no murders in the entire country. Murders are occurring overwhelmingly. Let's be honest. It's like people won't actually talk about it. Young black men between the ages of like 16 and 40 represent around 2% of the population and commit half of all murders.
It's actually 60. It's actually more like 60% now.
Yeah, over half of all murders committed by young black men between the ages of 16 and 40. Now, why will people not say that? Because they're terrified they're going to get called racist. Well, you can't solve a problem in this country until you acknowledge where the problem is coming from. And, Buck, it's not just Biden. Mayorkas, who's a disaster at the border, echoed Biden and said white supremacy is the number one problem in America. I think we have that audio. I would submit to you, white supremacy is not in the top 50. It's not in the top 100. I'm not sure it's in the top 250 biggest issues that this country is facing right now. But the lie that is being spread, listen to this, Mayorkas endorses Biden's big lie.
The president yesterday at his commencement address for the Howard University graduates called white supremacy the major domestic terror threat in this country. Is that correct?
It tragically is. You know, in the terrorism context, domestic violent extremism is our greatest threat right now. Individuals driven to violence because of ideologies of hate, anti-government sentiments, false narratives, personal grievances, and the like. And regrettably, we have seen a rise in white supremacy.
Okay, first of all, it's a constant Democrat talking point. There's more hate crimes. There's a rise in white supremacy. It is basically always a lie. They do this by changing the definitions, changing the way they calculate the statistics. You know, this is where you always hear, oh, there was such a rise in white supremacy, for example, under the Obama administration. That's just every time you've looked at an analysis, and I used to do this because I would go and argue with people during the Obama administration on TV about this. They would change the way they calculated hate crimes and things like that are related to white supremacy so that they could make this case, oh, it's gotten so much worse. It's not true. The media talking about it has amplified, has magnified dramatically. But let's understand something here. A couple things that come to mind, Clay, when they're doing this. Propaganda on the media. One is they create a circumstance where they mobilize, they separate people based upon race, gender, whatever, and then mobilize them on those characteristics. And what this allows then is anyone who says, hold on, why are you doing this? We're all Americans. Why are you separating us by race? Why do you insist on trying to aggravate old racial wounds for your own political benefit? Anyone who says that is a part of the white supremacy problem, right? Yes. Anyone who actually argues for just treating everybody as fellow Americans and or, fellow human beings, is treated like they're part of the problem based on the rhetoric that they deploy. And then specifically on the terrorism threat. I mean, you ask yourself this question. How many people walking around of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds right now, they walk around and they go, oh my God, I'm so scared of the white supremacist terrorist who might come in right now. Or I'm scared of the white supremacist terrorist when I get on an airplane or whatever. We all inherently know, we instinctively know this is bizarre. This is some fantasy land that they've concocted in a country of 330 million people. There might be one or two mass casualty white supremacist lunatics shooting people or something in any given year that are really clearly not just someone who's insane, not just somebody, but somebody who's actually attached himself to an ideology. Why won't they release the Nashville Trans Terrorist Manifesto? Because the narrative of white supremacy and white supremacist terrorism is useful for explaining the failures of the Democrat Party away at the border, in cities where there's violence. Oh, if you talk about it, you're a white supremacist. And as you know, Clay, they attach all of this to Donald Trump and the January 6th insurrection. They were saying, January 6th riot, they called it an insurrection. They were saying this stuff about Trump before any of that even happened. So They're just changing all the definitions, and they're obviously engaged in, I think, just a massive con against the American people by pretending like this is a much bigger, and Biden's the absolute worst.
And Buck, note what they've done, and I think this is important too. Democrats have so devalued accusations of racism that they don't even hardly use the word racism anymore, right? They've now moved on from racism to white supremacy because people started to ask questions, and I think it was a good one. Wait a minute. If racism exists, shouldn't it exist across multiple different racial groups? And, of course, Democrats would argue, no, only white people can be racist. But when everything is racist, it's the boy who cried wolf theory. It doesn't really motivate anymore. And so they have tried to go to the new scare tactic. The next phrase up is white supremacy, which, Buck, you can legitimately track in the media. When I say no one talked about white supremacy as a danger in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that's 100% true. It didn't exist as a phrase that was used. And I would just ask all of you out there, when do you think there were more white supremacists? The 1970s or the 2020s? This idea that somehow in 2023 we've got an influx of white supremacists. No, in 1970s there were way more white supremacists. The reality is there's never been very many of them, and most of them are powerless, and they have almost no economic muscle behind them. And so they've created this new boogeyman, look underneath the bed, oh, the awful white supremacist is there, when the reality is it just doesn't exist as a legitimate threat. To argue that it's the biggest threat that America faces today is such a transparent lie that you have to ask yourself, why are they trying this? And why are their allies in the media continuing to boost it? And the reality is, this is what identity politics requires. This is what the Democrat Party is. It's the oppression Olympics, and white men have to be at the peak of power in order to justify everything that Democrats are trying to do.